Hey everybody, this is Matthew Soltesiak and you're listening to Not the Same Old Lions podcast. Using my sportscasting background, I speak with a variety of guests and interview key players to gain more insight on what makes this team go. As the Detroit Lions enter a new gritty era, we'll look beyond just the kneecaps when it comes to the analysis. Welcome to another episode. Today we're going to take a look at not just the Lions, but the NFC North as a whole. I'm joined by James Cook, senior sports writer for the Traverse City Record Eagle. You can also hear him on the Get Around podcast. It drops on Mondays. Good to have you here, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So when the season ended, the Vikings had won the division. They were the only team to make the playoffs from the NFC North with a 13-4 record. The Lions came in second at 9-8, followed by the Packers, a game behind them. And then in the basement, we had the Bears at 3-14. Now, records are important, but they don't begin to tell the whole story on this season. And, of course, we know there's going to be some changes coming up with free agency and the draft, and everyone's going to make adjustments before then. But there does not appear to be any head coaching changes in the division this offseason. So what do you make of the division at this point, James?
It's interesting that you have teams that are in such kind of opposite directions. The Packers and the Vikings are very tight up against the salary cap. May end up being put in the position where they have to cut some players, some veteran players who were contributors over the last few years. You've got the Bears, who have just a bounty of salary cap space and draft picks, and that could be even more if they trade that number one overall pick and get just a haul for that, which is possible. I mean, if they're set on Justin Fields as their guy at quarterback, why draft somebody at number one when you can trade that pick to somebody else who wants a quarterback and move down a few spots and probably still get the guy you want?
And that number one pick is much more desirable this year than last year.
Yeah, because there's three quarterbacks up at the top that everybody has in various orders. But it's pretty much the same consensus on those three guys, and then a drop off after those three. So you could see some. There's way more than three teams that need a quarterback.
Right, and if the Bears do move down, that'll allow them to get more and more players because they've got Justin Fields. A lot of people are pretty excited about him. They see a lot of potential there. We saw some flashes. I don't know that I am yet sold on him, and I think my bias probably comes from the history of Ohio State quarterbacks.
Yeah, I have that too. It's just the whole Ohio State thing and their quarterbacks not being great in the NFL, and he hasn't disproven that as far as his throwing ability. I mean, you look at when they won games, he only a couple of those games he didn't throw for 100 yards.
Right,
but he ran for like 150. So I mean, he's a different kind of quarterback. More Lamar Jackson than a lot of other quarterbacks in the league. Not as much Jalen Hurts, because Jalen Hurts has pretty well established himself as a guy who can throw the ball just as well as he can run.
He did prove that this year. And now there were a lot of questions coming into this year on Jalen Hurts. And I guess if you're looking at those two teams, the big takeaway difference right now is Philadelphia had a great offensive line, and the Bears have the opposite of that. So we have to say, in all fairness to Justin Fields, we've got to see if the Bears can give him a good offensive line, you could see a big step forward. Plus, they're still trying to figure out their wide receiving core over there in Chicago.
Yeah, that's the thing. It is hard to give him a grade, I guess. Justin Fields. I guess it would be incomplete at this point because, they don't have a good offensive line. They had one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL last year, I think. Their receiving core was very middle of the road at best, and not even that after Darnell Mooney got hurt. You look at them, I think best case scenario for them is to have Darnell Mooney as your number 2 receiver and Claypool as your number 3. But they don't have a number 1. They got to go out and get one, either in free agency or in the draft. They're in position to be able to do that, and then use some of those draft assets to get some offensive linemen, and then you could be looking at this team being a team that could make big steps, I think, in the next year or two.
It wouldn't be surprised if you saw the Bears to try and take a step forward and try and get close to that 500 level. Do I think they're seriously going to compete for the NFC North title this year? No, I don't think anybody does. But I think it does start with that offensive line, as you talked about. Their defense actually isn't as good as people might think it is. They gave up more points than the Minnesota Vikings did this year. Trading Roquan Smith in the middle of the season probably didn't help that matter.
Traded their 2 best defensive players in the middle of the season. That defense was not great. That's maybe another thing that they can just try to fix in this draft. I mean, right now they don't have. I guess they have more draft picks than most teams. They got an extra 4th and an extra 5th. But I think they're going to add to that. I think that there's a pretty good chance that they try to trade down in the first round. At least a couple spots, if not maybe a bigger spot, and get just a gigantic haul of draft picks and maybe a couple of players even in that from somebody who's desperate for one of those 3 quarterbacks. Or for somebody who has fallen in love specifically with only one of those 3 quarterbacks and has to have that guy.
I mean, we've seen that in the past. Look what San Francisco gave up to try and get up and get Trey Lance. Mm-hmm. So the Bears are definitely in a great position to do that. They've got great salary cap space. So even though we don't think they're going to compete for the North title, I would not be surprised to see a major improvement from that team come next fall.
Right. I mean, as of right now, they have $119 million in cap space.
That's astronomical.
That is crazy. You remember like a couple years ago when the Jaguars, I think it was going into the Urban Meyer season, they had all that cap space and they spent it on all these big free agents and everything at once. They had about that much money.
So yeah, the Bears have a lot of opportunity to improve.
Yeah, and the free agents, they have a lot of free agents this year, but not a lot of them are their big name players, guys that are going to cost a lot of money to bring back. Probably the biggest name one is David Montgomery, their running back.
That's exactly who I was going to go with.
And they've got Khalil Herbert, who appears to be a guy that they could just slide in if they, for some reason, part ways with Montgomery.
That's a big question. I wonder if they bring Montgomery back. He's a guy I feel like they've always underused since he arrived there because he seems like a great runner. And I guess the question is, how much do they want to pay for a running back? With Herbert playing as well as he did last year, they might decide to move on from Montgomery. Is Montgomery a guy the Lions could look at if Jamal Williams doesn't come back?
It could be. I mean, I like the possibility of Jamal Williams come back with the Lions. I like that when he was interviewed this week during various, he went on ESPN, Good Morning Football and all that stuff, he referred to the Lions as we. Like he assumes that he's coming back.
I like that attitude as well, the inclusiveness.
Yeah. I think he said we run the North.
Yes,
now,
I like that.
Or something like
already
that.
Showing the confidence there. I do hope we bring Jamal Williams back as well because it's not just what he does on the field, but it's what he does in the locker room. Mm-hmm. So while we think the Bears are going to add some improvement to their team because they have so much potential spots to do that, and we think they'll probably move their way up towards the middle of the 500 level for competing, the Vikings, they were the team that won the division. And I think most people are probably presuming Minnesota's going to take a step backwards next year because their point differential actually was in the negative, even though they had such a good record at 13-4.
Yeah, I think so. Unless Brian Flores can work some magic with this defense, I think everybody saw that coming for the playoffs, that nobody was afraid of the Vikings. They knew they could score some points, but they knew that they were going to get a lot of points. So nobody was really scared. I think teams were more worried about the Lions sneaking into the playoffs than the Vikings. Unless Flores really pans out or they do something with that defense, they definitely, I think, are going to regress next season. They're in bad cap space.
Very bad.
They're over the cap right now by over $7 million.
So I'm expecting guys like Adam Thielen, he's going to have to take a serious pay cut or he won't be back. Mm-hmm. There's a chance that Dalvin Cook's a cap casualty as well.
That could be. And when Alexander Madison's a free agent as well, their other running back, really good running back, who if they had him under contract, then you could let Dalvin Cook go. I'm not sure on his age, but I mean he's up there. He's got high mileage and he's been hurt a couple of times. So,
but then you got T.J. Hockenson who's going to get a pay raise next year, and then if they're going to extend him, that's going to cost more money. Mm-hmm. So they do have a lot of salary cap issue things to worry about and figure out there. So I'm expecting a regress from the Vikings.
I think big time. Being that much over the cap, they have their free agents that they have to take care of. Their center is a free agent. And he's a really good one. He's gonna cost a lot of money to retain, probably over $10 million a season, if they want to keep him. Greg Joseph, their pretty good kicker, is a free agent as well. Irv Smith, the other tight end, they like to use as well. Aside from Hockenson, is a free agent. Patrick Peterson. I mean, they've got a lot of free agents. I've heard possibilities that even Harrison Smith could be a salary cap casualty.
Yeah,
and he's with their probably their best defensive player, him and Eric Kendricks, who is another guy who could be a cap casualty.
There's going to be a very different looking team on the Minnesota defensive side and potentially the offensive side next year.
Yeah,
I don't think Irv Smith is coming back with the T.J. Hawkinson move. I don't think you can afford to pay 2 tight ends
unless they get a deal on him, because maybe teams in free agency will be leery of him because he's had injury history the last 2 years, can't stay on the field. So maybe they get a deal on bringing him back on like a 1-year kind of prove it, see if you can stay healthy type of contract. But the other thing that the Vikings are looking at is they don't have a whole lot of assets as far as draft picks. They have a first round pick this year. They don't have a second. They have a third, a fourth, and a fifth, and that's it. No sixth, no seventh.
That's not a whole lot to bring in some new talent.
They only have 4 draft picks, and only one of those is really high. Fixing this overnight, I don't think is going to happen for them. So I think a regression for them is bound to happen.
Now, I'm not going to count them out of competing for the division because they had 13 wins this year, but I don't think you'll see them anywhere near that 13 number. I think you might be looking at somewhere around 9 or 10 games, and it's going to depend.
With that offense, they can do that. I think if they can keep that offense pretty somewhat intact, and losing Adam Thielen, if they let him go, KJ Osborne was a great player for them the second half of the season. I think he's a breakout player for them. Would immediately step into that number 2 receiver spot. They wouldn't lose a lot.
No, they need KJ Osborne to become more consistent because he did show some great flashes this second half of the season. And if he can shore up that number 2 spot, that would help the offense out a lot.
I think that if that happens, I think they're not worried about that number 2 spot with him. He stepped in last year as a rookie and played just really, really well for somebody in their first year. I mean, it's becoming more and more of a thing now where rookies come in as wide receivers. I mean, you're the same age as me. You know how it used to be if you play fantasy football. You stay away from the wide receivers in their first or second year.
Totally.
Because teams just developed them. And they didn't play full-time for a couple of years a lot of times.
Right, they just didn't get it. It was the exception if they were going to be successful.
Same thing with tight ends. It's like you waited and you saw who was in their third year, and that's when you drafted them. And it's not that way anymore.
Now look what Chris Olave did this year, right?
Yeah, look at Garrett Wilson. Any number of receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown last season.
Yeah.
And then turning that around into a stellar season this year too. But that's just not the thing anymore that it used to be.
Well, the odds actually just came out recently about who they were predicting to, win the NFC as a whole, and 3 out of the top 7 teams actually come out of the North. The Lions, the Packers, and the Vikings. Now, the Vikings are like number 7 on that list, and the Lions and Packers were actually tied with each other. I think at 4 and 5 on the list. And the Lions and Packers, I believe, have about the same expectations to win the NFC North. What are you thinking on the Packers right now? There's a lot of question marks surrounding that team.
Yeah, I mean, the first and foremost is the obvious one of quarterback. What do you do with Aaron Rodgers? Do you trade him? Financially, they're not in a situation where they can afford to cut him. Too much of that contract becomes accelerated, and it becomes just something that you can't do. I mean, they're over the cap as it is right now.
Yep.
They can't take, I think it's a $50 or $80 million hit, I think, if they cut him right now. If they trade him, it's much less.
Right, it's like $29 million or something like that.
So yeah, they could trade him, and they could do it as long as they don't take on another quarterback or somebody who's making a lot of money, and hand the ball over to Jordan Love, who's still in his rookie contract. It's a rookie first round quarterback contract, so it's still not real cheap.
Yeah.
But it's a pittance compared to what Aaron Rodgers is getting. And then you go from there. I mean,
well, let's look at that quarterback thing for a minute. As a Lions fan, do you want the Packers to keep Aaron Rodgers, knowing he takes up so much of their salary cap, it affects what they can put around him? Or are you ready to say goodbye, Aaron, and hope he goes somewhere like to the Jets in the AFC so you don't have to see him?
Mm-hmm. If I'm a Lions fan, I would want them to bring Aaron Rodgers back. Last year, you saw he obviously has lost a little bit too.
Well, and losing Devontae Adams, some of the pieces around him, his number one reliable target was gone. That definitely affected him the first half of the season.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, they had some great rookie wide receivers last season that, as the season went on, started producing more and more and getting better and better in Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. But Allen Lazard is a free agent this season, and that's one of his other favorite targets. Randall Cobb is a free agent. If Aaron Rodgers doesn't come back, neither is Randall Cobb. The Packers aren't going to bring Randall Cobb back.
They only brought him back because Aaron Rodgers requested
Rodgers
them to do that.
So if they trade Rodgers to the Jets or whoever else, then Cobb's out of the equation. I'm pretty sure they're going to let him retire. Robert Tunyon's a free agent. That's another one of his favorite targets, one of the guys he likes. Mercedes Lewis is a free agent. So both of their top 2 tight ends. The Mercedes Lewis story is just great about how old that dude is and still playing in the NFL at tight end and playing at a pretty good level.
Sure.
But they're over $9 million over the cap right now. So they're going to have to cut players. They have more draft capital than the Vikings do.
Yeah, they got some of that with the Adams trade.
So they can replace some guys with guys on rookie contracts and stuff. The Vikings, one of those picks that they traded away was for Hawkinson. So that paid off well for them and everything. But the Packers pretty much just have their own picks and a couple of extra 7s.
Yeah, I can't argue with the idea of them keeping Aaron Rodgers because, again, with the salary cap space that his contract takes up, it limits what they can put around him. It seems like they could rebuild quicker if they were to move on from him because their defense was actually not very bad. They had a decent defense last year.
Their defense was solid. Their defense was solid, and most of the players that are free agents for them on their defense are the role players. Adrian Amos, their free safety, is a guy that they have to bring back, I think, find a way to bring back. He's a free agent. They're going to be in the same position as the Vikings, I think, where they're going to have to maybe look at cutting some of those expensive veterans that they have to free up space to be able to bring back some of those guys, to be able to get under the cap enough to be able to sign those rookie draft picks, and then maybe not even be in position to sign hardly any free agents from outside the organization.
Right, they're going to have to be looking for deals outside the organization if they want to bring in some free agents.
Yeah.
But their defense was the best one in the NFC North, so they don't have to build up as much on that side of the ball. While their defense was the best, I think ours, the Detroit Lions defense, improved the most throughout the season and gives you hope going forward because not only do we see growth from our rookies, we have some cap flexibility. We can bring in some free agents as well.
Yeah, the Lions have some space. They don't have like an abundance like the Bears, or not even close.
No, nobody does.
But they have enough to be able to go after 1 or 2 potential starters in free agency, and then try to find what has been Brad Holmes' MO the last 2 years is find guys who you can bring in on 1-year prove-it contracts and see if they work. Guys like Charles Harris.
John Kaminsky.
Yeah.
You got him off. Isaiah Buggs.
Kaminsky was a great one. Buggs, yep. Anzalone. Guys that they can get at reasonable contracts, and you hope you get starter level production. You're not looking for superstar level production. That's how you do the money ball in the NFL.
And so the Lions now are going to have to make some decisions on some of those guys because some of those guys they brought in are free agents now. And that's going to be a big question mark. I think the biggest name out there is DJ Shark because he's going to probably command the biggest contract. Jamal Williams, the other question is, are you going to pay him as much as he's going to command? Now, not demand, but command. Because there's going to be some offers coming out for each of those guys. And it'll be interesting to see who else goes after them and what those offers are compared to what the Lions are willing to offer up.
I think Williams is much more realistic in that there's a glut of running backs in free agency this year. So
Agreed.
Running backs and in the draft. It's a great year for general managers to bring in running backs and a horrible year for running backs to be free agents.
It really is. Wide receivers like the opposite. DJ Shark, I think, is going to be the number 1 receiver out there.
Wide receivers, opposite. DJ Shark's going to get, double-digit $1 million a year in free agency. Whether that's to the Lions or somebody else, I don't know. The Lions are thinking that they have Jameson Williams, who's maybe going to be their 1A, 1B with Brown, and then you try to find somebody else. Do you hope maybe Quintez Cephas finally stays healthy for a season? Do you just keep leaning on Khalif Raymond?
Guys, you've got Josh Reynolds like there that. On the side as the number 3. You still got Reynolds
under contract for another year or so. You could try to get along with those guys and not pay Chark, which is a pretty realistic option, I think. I don't think that they're going to overpay. No,
and then they have to be careful because, the offense was good. You want to make sure the offense doesn't regress from this year to next year. But at the same time, you need to put more resources into the defense. So that's where that tricky thing is where you don't want an overabundance of wide receivers that can't all get the ball and then not have a defensive back or a linebacker to help out on the defense. So that's going to be an interesting balance to see how they run that out.
Yeah. Some of the guys I think they're going to lose in free agency, guys that other teams are going to offer more money than the Lions are going to want to give them, it's going to be, I think, Chark, Evan Brown. I think somebody will offer him more of a contract than the Lions are going to want to give him. And then they've got a bunch of players on defense. They got a hope come up like those other players, like, what was it, Bugs, Anzalone, and I think who the third one was it Kaminsky? There was 3 players, though, that said, we'll take undervalue to come back to Detroit.
Those seem to be about the right people. They do.
And I knew it was Anzalone and Bugs were 2 of them, and I can't remember who the third one was.
But it sounds like Kaminsky was that right type of person.
And that's what they're going to have to get, because I think they need to re-sign Deshaun Elliott.
No, I think Elliott's going to get a lot of offers, or a lot of interest at least out there. Because the other big question is Tracy Walker going to come back healthy? Because if you have Walker and Joseph, you're feeling good if they're both completely healthy. But Elliott was a vital piece of that defense. The question is, can you afford him back there with Walker having a big contract as well? We know we need to bring in a couple of defensive backs, even with Okudah coming back.
Yeah. You still need somebody. I mean, they've got Jerry Jacobs, who he kind of up and down. Awarie is a free agent this year. He regressed so much last year after such a good season the season before. But maybe they get him to come back on a cheap deal.
But the top 2 defensive backs we have under contract are Okudah and Jacobs. I wouldn't be surprised if we re-sign at least one of our free agents, but I am expecting a draft spot and a free agent signing there.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, they're in a position in the draft with 2 first-round picks where I could see easily one of those being a defensive back. And there's guys in that range of both of those picks where they pick at 6 and 18 who would fit.
That makes sense.
And same thing with an elite defensive tackle. They see somebody at one of those picks. It's a defensive tackle who can push the pocket. That seems to be the way the NFL's moving now. It used to be the defensive ends and the edge rushers, and now defensive coordinators love that defensive tackle who can push the pocket, all that kind of stuff.
Get all that extra pressure on the quarterback, force an error.
Yeah. But I think you're right about defensive backs. They got to invest some money in defensive backs. If they're going to play the same defense they did last year, they played in the nickel almost all the time.
Yeah, you definitely need some more coverage out there then.
So I don't know if that was because they did out of necessity, because they felt their defensive backs were better than their linebackers, because after the top couple of linebackers, there was a big drop-off. Whether they can do that again, I don't know, but they're in a position in the draft, and in what seems to be a decent draft for linebackers where they could maybe help that linebacker core. I think they've got to in free agency or the draft.
Yeah,
add
if not both.
1 or 2
linebackers
to that.
And then see who they're bringing back as well, because like you mentioned, Anzalone is a free agent as well.
Yeah.
So we talked about the Bears finishing. We think they're going to, get closer to 500. They took up 4th. The Vikings are going to regress. The Packers are the Packers, right? They won 3 years in a row before this past year. We don't count them out regardless of what's going on. If you look at their division records this year, the Vikings were 4-2 in the division. Lions were 5-1. Packers were 500, and the Bears were winless. So I do think it's going to be a 3-team race for that top. I'm not going to count Minnesota out, and I'm not counting Green Bay out until we know how the dust settles. And as high as expectations are for the Lions, there's always going to be the naysayers and the people who won't believe it until they see it.
Yeah, I think so. And I wouldn't count the Bears out as making I think they're going to make a step forward next year at a minimum.
Well, James, thanks again for joining the show today. It was great talking with you about the Lions.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.
And again, that's James Cook, senior sports writer for the Traverse City Record Eagle. Remember, you can catch him at the Get Around podcast. That drops on Mondays. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please subscribe to the podcast to get alerts about new episodes. And until next time, stay gritty, my friends.